Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be discussing this book, On Trails, by Robert Moore. The subtitle is An Exploration. I mentioned this book in another rant recently, the rant about Whistler's Way. I think that was just last week, but I might be mistaking it slightly. This is a book mostly about trails within the United States of America, and to some degree how they connect to trails elsewhere. This is copyright 2016. The book designed by Ellen R. Sasahara. Cover design and illustration by Jim Tierney. Okay, so there are a couple notes of praise from authors and magazines and publications. The two that are most interesting to me are a quote of praise from David Quammen. It says, author of Spillover and The Song of the Dodo, though I think I recognize him from other books, not those two specifically. Rather, I know I recognize him, but not from those two books. Robert Moore gets you thinking, what is the meaning of trails in human history, ecology, the journeys of life? Gary Snyder and Dharma, E.O. Wilson and Ants, the International Appalachian Trail? It's a sinuous route to a robust relationship between feet and landscape. Walk on. So that one's David Quammen. I've read some of his books as well and consider him a good writer. And then there's also this praise from another author. Robert Moore's primer on the history of trails is a literary gem encompassing everything from insect travel to road building in colonial America. Addictive readers and knowledge junkies, however, should be careful. On Trails is a whirlpool of fact that will suck you in and not let go. That is praise from Rinker Buck, author of The Oregon Trail. I haven't ranted about that yet, but I have that book on my list that will be read very shortly. I've got Son of the Storm and The Nature Principle currently, and third book in line is going to be The Oregon Trail. I suspect I won't get to that one until I'm on my vacation this year, and given that I'll be doing a river trail on the East Coast, the Susquehanna River Trail, I may read it then, but it really depends. It'll be paddling a lot of, I want to say 16 miles per day over the course of 3 days. So we may have a bit of additional challenge in that regard. The prologue is long, and this one was a bit too long in my opinion, but it opens with this. Once, years ago, I left home looking for a grand adventure and spent 5 months staring at mud. It was the spring of 2009, and I had set out to walk the full length of the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine. My departure date was timed so that I could transition seamlessly from a mild southern spring to a balmy northern summer, but for some reason the warmth never arrived. It stayed cool that year, rained often. Newspapers likened it to the freak summer of 1816, when cornfields froze to their roots, pink snow fell over Italy, and a young Mary Shelley, locked up in a gloomy villa in Switzerland, began to dream of monsters. My memories of the hike consist chiefly of whetstone and black earth. The vistas from many of the mountaintops were blotted out. Shrouded in mist, rain hood up, eyes downcast, mile after mile, month after month, I had little else to do but study the trail beneath my nose with Talmudic intensity. Talmudic? But there's some really interesting aspects of this narrative as well, such as a lot of the history of other trails, such as the Pacific Crest and Continental Divide trails, efforts within the Appalachian Trail community to recognize every portion of the mountains that are called the Appalachian Mountains. And the difficulty with that is that the mountain range actually extends into some really unusual countries. You would think, okay, the Appalachian Trail, if it's going to extend north, because south, you eventually hit the Mississippi Delta and there's no mountains there. And you would be right. So, what other direction does it expand? Well, if you go north, you hit Canada, and that makes sense. There's some mountains on the northeast of Canada that you would have to reach. You would have to cross what are now larger gaps of, bodies of water, but you hop a ferry and do some mountains in northeastern Canada, and hey, you know, you've got some hiking going on. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because as it turns out, the mountains that we call the Appalachian Mountains are part of an incredibly ancient mountain range. And geologically speaking, everything north and west of Loch Ness in Scotland, ancestral Appalachian Mountains. The fjords of Norway and that western ridgeline, Appalachian Mountains. And somehow, and I don't quite get how, and I think he explains it in here though, the mountains in Morocco, where the last Barbary lion was seen, that is also part of the Appalachian Mountains. When David Quammen talks about the International Appalachian Trail in that praise, it's because Robert Moore did a lot of research into the Appalachian Trail and the international efforts to expand it, and whether or not the northern terminus should extend. Would it be possible to do a full hike from northern terminus to southern terminus if it were to expand? There's also a portion of this book that takes the Navajo into account, specifically in a portion that is talking about how other animals form trails. And this is specifically because Robert Moore also ends up doing some work as a sheep herder. I think as research for this book, he says on page 121, according to the rancher William Herbert Guthrie Smith, when domestic sheep are brought to a new area, they immediately begin to establish a habitat for themselves by creating trails. He watched this process firsthand after he purchased 24,000 acres of rain-soaked New Zealand wilderness in 1882, which he patiently converted into a sheep ranch. The first action of sheep in a new land, he wrote, was to map it out, to explore it by lines radiating from established camps. The sheep trails snaked outward, skirting around bogs, cliffs, pitfalls, and blind, oozy creeks. Many sheep were reportedly swallowed up by the wet earth in this exploration process, but eventually the trails that failed to reach adequate foraging grounds faded, while the useful ones improved. The radial pattern that Guthrie Smith describes is common for sheep. Sunken paths, called hollow ways, have been found radiating out from Bronze Age villages in Mesopotamia. So that's the introduction of the sheep portion of this book. And then it expands, it says, according to Melville, in the 16th century, the introduction of Spanish sheep against the strenuous objections of the indigenous population converted a number of grasslands and oak forests to arid scrublands thick with thistles, mesquite, and other spiny plants. By the end of the century, Melville wrote, the good grazing lands of the 1570s had become scrub-covered badlands. In the 1930s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs believed that this process was taking place in the Begay's Corner of the Navajo Reservation. And he says that because he's living with a family of Navajos with the last name Begay, though to anyone that knows the Navajo Reservation, that is an incredibly non-descriptive way to, like, it makes sense in the narrative because he describes which corner of the Navajo Nation he is working on, where they live, so on and so forth. But Begay, spelled B-E-G-A-Y, is like the first or second most common last name on the Navajo Nation. So, I don't remember the history of how that name became so spread, but saying the Begays Corner is, it could be northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast. There's Begays all over the Navajo Nation. So I have to check back and read a bit more to see which portion of the Navajo Nation he's talking about, but it's also probably accurate to say that they thought that the process of scrub covered badlands was happening across the entire reservation. It says here between 1868 and 1930, the Navajo population grew fourfold. Their growth was fed by a roughly parallel explosion in the population of sheep and goats, which the Navajo herded along looping routes from the summer highlands to the winter lowlands. However, the soil had begun to dry out, and the good forage was giving way to aptly named toxic plants like snakeweed, sneezeweed, Russian thistle, and loco weed. Federal officials believed that if drastic reductions were not made in the Navajo livestock population, the bulk of the reservation might effectively degrade into a wasteland. It then also says the Navajo, who had lived on the land for centuries before Collier even arrived, were understandably upset by the notion of a white stranger from Georgia telling them how to manage their sheep. Some of Collier's advisors, like the forester Bob Marshall, stressed to him the importance of crafting an approach that respected the Navajos' metaphysical beliefs, complex family dynamics, and profound knowledge of the land. He did not heed this advice. He started instituting draconian systems of stock reduction. The Navajo Tribal Council tried to pass a number of resolutions in an effort to halt the regulations. Then Collier exercised his congressionally mandated veto power. In frustration, many Navajos resisted violently while others protested to Congress. And then by 1945, Collier was ousted and his livestock reduction plan quietly scrapped. His bitter tenure is still remembered by many Navajos as a period of cultural genocide. And so it's not just the established trails, these big destination trails that he talks about. It's not just how those trails could expand and what the definition of trail is and what makes a trail a complete trail terminus to terminus. Also goes into how animals create trails, how people affect paths, they create shortcuts, so on and so forth. It's a very widely focused book, and it has the time to. It's 330 pages long, so it really can expand into these broader topics. He talks about deer trails a couple times. He talks about getting to Mount Katahdin and Appalachian Trail on August 15th, almost 5 months to the day after I had started out from Springer Mountain. I reached the summit of Mount Katahdin in Maine. Far below in every direction were green forests and blue lakes and islands of green forest within the blue of the lakes. After what felt like months of steady rain, the skies had finally cleared. I could feel the dampness baking from my bones. I had at last reached the trail's end. And so, like all good stories, they do have to come to an end as well. And I felt like this one was a comforting end. I felt like I had learned a lot, but it hadn't strayed so far from its intended direction that I was lost or misled or confused at any time. So I do want to say that it was a really good book. However, I don't know how much money I paid for this. I know I bought it at Coas Books. It is listed as $17 US, $23 Canada on the barcode section. So, if this is the sort of information you want to read about, I highly recommend On Trails. The cover says it's a New York Times bestseller. So, there's that as well if you take into consideration the New York Times bestseller list. It's just a really good book in general, though, and I think if you have any interest in the books that I discussed in the past, Whistler's Way or The Thousand Mile Summer, or some of these books about longer trails or hiking or that sort of thing. What was it? The one with a camel was a riding trail, I guess, but it's a similar style of thing. Um, a Stranger in the Forest, which was about hiking through Borneo. If you like those kinds of books, I suspect you'll like On Trails, though it is more on the 2000s side of things than the 1970s and 1950s side of things. There's a lot more cultural understanding and relevancy and respect in this book than there is in some of those older books. So, yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.